This conference will now be recorded.
So welcome everybody, and a warm welcome to you, Hilary. Warmest day of the year. This is the birthday present that I wanted from Hilary to do a call on making content strategy stick. This was supposed to be in person, a 3-hour workshop in Brooklyn at the beginning of May, but that didn't happen due to the pandemic. But here we are now receiving the condensed version. Over to you, Hilary.
Yeah, so before I started, I did want to wish you happy birthday. Um,
Thank
so
you.
I'm thrilled to be able to do this on your birthday.
That's
So
exactly what I wanted. Thank you.
oh, good. This topic is very near and dear to my heart because content strategy is a lot of work to get done, and we want to make sure that it is sustainable over time. So there's 3 elements, and I'm going to zoom through these really quickly at 75 miles an hour, and with the goal that you can see the slides later, you have the blog post already, you can get the recording later. So I'm not going to be able to cover in depth any of these points, but I just wanted to go over them with you anyway. So there's 3 parts. The first is build a strong foundation, which is the content strategy work itself. The second is to foster champions and allies, and I have lots of thoughts about that. And then keep content practices top of mind. So to build a strong foundation, we have to start with the first thing, which is what is content? So in all of our organizations, especially if you're working at an enterprise kind of level, the people who are creating content don't really understand that that's what they're doing. They're meeting planners, or they're technical writers, or they're support specialists, or they're customer service people, but what they're doing is creating content. All of their work ends up in the world as words and pictures and audio and video, aka content. So when we're talking about strategy for your content, it's about the organization's work, which is really where you have to start, because otherwise people are going to hear content strategy and think, well, that doesn't apply to me. I don't work in marketing. I don't only produce blog posts. But content is all of our work. So that's your content. And then the content takes different forms. For the most part, more and more they're online, but there are still brochures and reports and things that are either kind of online in some sort of hidden back corner, or they're never online. But that's still content and still needs to be conceived and thought about in a holistic way. So content strategy then is making sure that the right content gets to the right person at the right time for the right action or reason. And I find that final piece is what do we want actually to happen for this content and with this content? That's the trickiest conversation to have in our organizations. So this is like the standard definition of content strategy, only I've added a word. So content strategy is the practice of planning for the creation, delivery, and governance of content that is useful to the user. It's relevant to them. It's usable, meaning they know what it is, they understand it, it's written for them, and it's effective. And that's the word that I have just added to the official definition in the past year, because I felt like it was missing. So that effective is, did it have a clear audience? Did it have measurable goals? And did it work? Because a lot of times we just think working means I put it out there online or in a brochure or wherever it is. But we need to know whether or not it's working to make better decisions about the content. So when I do a content strategy project, I developed over years this roadmap. So this is why content strategy work typically for me happens outside of the context of a big redesign, and ideally happens first. Because if we do all this work first, then a website redesign or replatforming and all of that goes much more smoothly, because you've done the important thinking about really the meat that is in your website. I always have to start with understanding the organization's goals and challenges. And even if I was internal, going through the formal process of documenting all of that, going through any kind of audience surveys and research we've done, interviewing the people who are in charge of the content creating organizations, and doing all of that is important to do. So then we go through exercises to help the organization really come to a common place to understand the audiences, to then take a deep dive into the content itself. Number 3, maybe look at competitive organizations, actually create the content guidelines, roles and life cycle. So this is the part that I'm zooming through, et cetera, right? And however, when I would go back to clients sometimes months later to say, okay, so we did all this work together, how's it going? I found that plenty of times it was sitting there collecting dust on a shelf. And I realized that it's this making it stick part that's missing. And also sometimes we didn't really think that through. So, and I realized that putting content strategy into action is more than just the documents. And the documents themselves are aspirational. They talk about what's going to happen, not what is happening. And that's the part that has to change. And so I added 2 extra steps to my roadmap so that I leave clients with something that is sustainable. So the 2 extra steps are to determine your staffing needs. So a lot of times things don't happen because they don't have the right or typically enough people to actually execute all of the work we did beforehand. And 2, they haven't planned for making it part of people's everyday life. So the training, the communications, and the actual operations. So steps 1 through 9 is really figuring it out. So that's doing the content strategy work. 10 and 11 is making it operational. So the second piece I want to talk about, which is the other sort of plank of the underlying work, is once you have figured it out, then you have to start the process of finding other people who are either willing allies or will help you champion it. So it's not just you, the content strategy person, being a lone voice in the wind in your organization. So I believe that at the end of the day, effective content requires a partnership between the people who have that subject matter expertise, whether it's, again, the people I talked about at the beginning, right? The customer service or the researchers or the people in your organization who are actually creating that raw material. So their subject matter expertise and your expertise in presenting and sharing content. And both of those are critical to effective content. And fostering that sense of partnership is a huge part of the work. So my opinion is that you need to show success before you can get your buy-in, really. So this is the order of things, but I want to take this chart and talk about it from the right to the left. So the end of success and the way that you're going to really make the content strategy stick is that you have a set of policies that everybody understands and everybody is willing to go along with. One sec. So before you can do that, you need to get executive buy-in, at least in the kind of hierarchical, more legacy organizations that I tend to work with. And before you can get the executive buy-in, you have to have done some pilot projects to know that the content strategy principles and practices that you've developed will actually work. And in order to do that, you have to find your champions. So the champions in your organization or the allies, are the people who already get it. They're the people who've been asking, like, so when can we start? When can we do this? When can I do more on social media? When can we have really clear guidelines about what goes on the homepage or not? Or how do I know when I should delete my content based on whatever topic it is or what type it is? And how can I get better templates for my work? So those people exist in your organization, and you need to find them. And typically they're finding you and sort of tugging at your sleeve, asking to do more. And that's great, because with those people, that's when you can do the learning. So let's figure it out together, right? Then we can say, here, I think that your type of content really, I see a drop off of usage after a year. Let's set a year as the automatic expiration date. And let's look at the past ones and what would happen if we delete the ones or archive them that are more than a year old. Will anybody notice? And then you'll have more sort of room on the landing page that houses your kind of content to showcase it better. And let's see how that works, and whether having fewer things on there instead of the content from 5 years ago, whether that helps, that extra space helps people see the new and current and relevant information you have, for example. Or what happens if we do our headlines differently? How will that affect how people find or use or embrace whatever it is that you're producing? So once you've learned, then it's time for the executive buy-in. And again, it's not so easy. I'm just trying to go really quickly. So the agenda for the meeting with the executive, the person who has to buy in, so it might be the chief marketing officer, it might be the CEO, it might be your chief information officer, or somebody else. You know, every organization's a little different. The agenda for the meeting is this. And frankly, it might not be you in the meeting, depending on how many levels of management your organization has. It might be that you're empowering your boss or your boss's boss to have the meeting with that executive. But whoever has the meeting, this is the agenda. One, we have a problem. Our content's a mess, and as a result, nobody's really knowing about or using the things that we work really hard to produce. They're not buying our products, they're not taking advantage of the services, whatever it is. And I know how to fix it. I've worked on the background, setting up all these guidelines to make the content better, to remove things that shouldn't be there, et cetera, et cetera. And here's how I know it's going to work, right? I've done these pilot projects, and I know that it makes a 30% difference in how much content people find and use and act on. And I'd like your approval to move forward. And that approval to move forward is your ticket, right? Because then you have something to hang your hat on when you say, here's how we're going to work, and the CEO has agreed and approved this. So it's not me anymore, it's the organization's policies, which is critical. And I find when you go back then to the subject matter experts and talk with them, then you want to change your language too and say, well, this isn't your content. You want to change the language and say it's our content, and help them see that the work that they produce is more effective because it's part of a bigger whole, that the whatever legal is producing has a relationship with what customer service is producing, with what marketing is producing. Because there's a saying out there from Lou Rosenfeld, and he wrote the famous book on information architecture, as well as a million other things, but he has a saying that your users don't care about your org chart, and it's true. And so changing the language of how we talk to our peers and colleagues internally about the content that the organization produces will help change that internal mindset. And you want to invite them into the process. You want to invite the subject matter experts into the process. You want to really establish that the work we're doing is with you and not to you. Because once you get the CEO buy-in, then it's, you know, you're taking your content strategy principles and practices and putting them into action group by group by group. And it's going to be change. Content strategy has so much change management in it. And this is how you make that more as smooth as you can. So you want to listen to their concerns, you want to understand their goals, understand who they're accountable to, and really hear them. You want to reinforce what they're doing well now and show them why it's good, and start putting training and education practices in place. help them see and empathize with the audience. So this we did with the roadmap, but you want to really bring out that work with them, walk them through it, hold their hands as they get used to it, and really help them see that working with you also it is a win-win. Also reusing content and adapting it and working in a new way. And we'll see if we have time to come back to that point later. That's a whole different presentation, which is important and worthwhile and good, but I don't think we have time for that this morning. So then once you've sort of established and worked with each group about creating their content in a new way, now it's time to really think about, so that all of that is sort of day one. What happens day two? So how to help good content practices go viral. So I wanted to use an example. So this is literally the book from Illinois, where I live in Chicago, about the rules of the road. So this is a screenshot of just one chapter, but and it contains everything that you might want to know about traffic laws, and even things that you didn't even know you wanted to know. But the book itself is 112 pages long. So this is a list of what the chapters are. It covers every possible aspect of rules of the road. So if we think about the analogy of driving and content strategy, this looks a lot like the roadmap, right? So here's all the ways that content works. But we don't just say, okay, here's the book, have at it, here you can drive. Instead, we set up all kinds of guardrails in place. We have signage. And when driving started, gosh, I had the statistic memorized and now I can't remember, but the first traffic light was like in 1891 in a town in Ohio, and they had to figure out, once cars started to be more common, how are we going to manage this faster speed and multiple vehicles traveling at the same time? And so over time, they developed this whole signage system, and this is the US is one, and to some degree, every country has had to do the same thing, although they're not all identical. So it's not only physical signage, it's walk, don't walk signs, so that we can manage the whole idea of pedestrians and drivers and lots of different kinds of things happening at the same time in a common kind of space. We didn't need this when there weren't vehicles, because people could just look, and there were no speed challenges in the same way. This is a picture from the UK where they're anticipating people's problems and anticipating challenges where not everybody understands that traffic is on the left here. So their habit might be look left, then look right, as we've been taught certainly here in the US, and they're going to walk into traffic. And all the same kind of mindset is really what you have to think about as you're putting the content strategy into place and making all of these new rules stick. So the one other piece is that there's training. Before a 16-year-old is, at least in the US, is handed a driver's license, they have to go through not only academic kind of training to learn what the rules of the road are, so we tell them, and then we reinforce that they know. We have them sit behind the wheel with a professional driving instructor and practice in the car in a safe environment before they can drive. And there's tremendous analogies between all of this process and content strategy sustainability, or really sustainability of anything else. And understanding or adapting something that exists already is the best way to go. You don't have to really create this from scratch, you just have to adapt it. And normally this is called content governance. So I gave a talk or a workshop at a Jay Boya conference a few years ago, and I had people go through all of that driving exercise to think about what that might look like. And it was in the name of content governance. So content governance is where we establish what all this stuff looks like, what the life cycle is, the team structure, who gets to decide, and responsibilities, what review processes are we going to have, et cetera, et cetera. And yet you have to think about, how are we going to make this stick, right? And so internally we have to look at HR, human resources. How do they do it? The biggest policies that I've seen inside a company are ones related to human resources. If you want to get promoted, here's your process. If you need to take maternity leave, here's your process. So what can we learn from what they do to build similar kinds of processes to help people understand the content related policies? So first is that content work needs to be part of people's jobs. Nobody has time to do work or work in a way that they're not going to be measured on, that their raise isn't based on, that their very, continued employment isn't based on. And so if you want to have that happen, you need to make sure that it's part of people's jobs. And so particularly on the subject matter expert side, in my experience, they either think they're responsible for everything, or they just throw it over the wall and give it to the content person to act on. But it really does take a partnership, and for that partnership to happen, it has to be part of their job. So that's where you have to literally work directly with HR and with management to make that happen. And then there's the communications and training part. So provide regular reminders and updates, share successes, communities of practice. Again, I don't want to read all of these because we're running out of time really fast. And make it hard to do it wrong. So that's the content management system is your friend here. Motivation science. So I learned that there are 3 things that you can put into place: peer pressure, habit sort of support the formation of habits, and help them monitor their progress to what their better content practices get them. So here's a couple of examples. Here in the electric company, here in the US, plenty of electric companies will show you your electricity usage compared to your neighbors, and that makes a difference. So how can we adapt a practice like that? Give them real-time feedback, reward their success in person by sharing it with the CEO or whatever it is. Bring the artifacts of your work to life. So what does that mean? So some of the artifacts that brought the most insights, you can put them into action. So this is an example of a persona, and it's just a document, but it helped when I had people blow up life-size cutouts of them, introduce them at a meeting. What was I going to say? Bring them, show them to people when they made a request for me, because in my previous job, one client turned them into posters or made a video of each of their personas to introduce them to the subject matter experts and keep them alive. And then there's ideas to make it fun. And again, these are typical kinds of HR things. Make laminated card-sized versions of the personas, have a scavenger hunt, and invite people to find content rot, which is content that's redundant, outdated, or trivial. Have jargon bingo so that we're working together and making it fun to avoid our internal jargon. Offer prizes of swag, like put some of the content principles on a pen and offer that as a prize. Or memes. So during COVID, this is our mayor. During COVID, people were spontaneously creating all kinds of memes based on our mayor's mandate for people to stay home. So somebody if you see one on the bottom, here's the Wizard of Oz. We're off to see the wizard, and Lori Lightfoot, our mayor, is like, nope, you're not doing that. And so have a contest, make it fun. Help people be proud of their content successes. So this is sort of that laminated card idea. And ultimately, when all of these pieces are in place, content strategy becomes part of how things work. So here's a bunch of resources for you. And again, you'll have this, so you can link to all of them. Some I've talked about in this particular Zoomy speedy talk, and others I mentioned in a longer version, but didn't get to talk about today. But I think you'll find them all useful anyway.
Thank you
And
very much, Hilary.
stay in touch.
Thank you. We do have 2 minutes left. Like Hilary said, we're gonna make this into a blog post. You can get the slides. Any questions, comments, reflections? Let me then perhaps just pick on one or two. I think thank you, Hilary, for taking the time with us. Perhaps just feedback, one or two. You can go on camera or you can unmute. I see you, Mark.
I
Let's
have
see.
a quick question.
Oh yeah, here's you go. Katie has a question. So you're off the hook, Mark, for now.
Thanks. Maybe next time. I've got to run, but that was great. Thank you, Hilary.
All right, that's just what I wanted. All right, Katie, you got the question.
Yeah, so at Shopify, we have a pretty diverse content team or content team structure, I guess. And so within any like particular product line or service line, there are, product content strategists, product marketers, technical content people, support content people. And so there's kind of like all these disparate content teams. And I think some of the points you made about governance, like definitely hit on like all of the main activities I would expect to be happening. But I was wondering if you have any pointers for aligning governance across kind of all of those different life cycles and channels and things, because there's kind of different people owning the content in those.
Yeah, so ultimately it's they have to see that they're more aligned than they are different, because it's the same customers on the other end, and the same company. So there's a reason that the single company has these multiple products. And so if we're working in a way that's at odds with each other, then we're ultimately not helping the consumer. So I think that it's just bringing everything together, looking at the areas of commonality and figuring out whether the differences really need to stay different. So voice and tone is a great example of what you're talking about. So an organization might have a common voice, but the tone is expressed in a modified way. So based on, the type of content it is, for example. So I see governance as something similar. So we have like a standard baseline that we all use, and then here are the exceptions. So content types are the same, right? There's the default. For example, the way I usually set up content lifecycle rules is that the default assumption is that our content is current and accurate for a year. But people are like, no, mine is accurate forever. And mine needs to go away in 30 days. So we adapt it. So here's the universal, and here are the exceptions. So everybody needs to come together to understand what can be universal and what shouldn't be universal. So sometimes I've held like a content summit, where I bring the people together in a room for a day, because part of it is that people don't know each other and they don't talk to each other. So they just think of themselves as a self-contained, separate entity instead of part of a bigger whole. Make sense?
All right.
Yeah, thanks, Hilary. I definitely was curious mostly about like the life cycle side of it. So I think you made a couple good points that's helpful. Thanks.
Sure.
All right. I think that's it for today. We're running 1 or 2 minutes over time. In these days, people jumping from one call to another. Let me finish off by saying thank you very much, Hilary. Thank you for putting all the time into this deck. Thank you for sharing with us. I really appreciate it. And I'll be in touch to follow up with the blog post and the slides so that we can get it out there.
Great.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much. Happy birthday.
Have a great day. Bye now.
Bye.